We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are the words of a Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, who endorsed as accepted by the members of the Second Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776, declaring as an independent nation the former colonies of the British Crown and its tyranny after the Resolution, proposed by another Virginian, Richard Henry Lee, who had proposed that these states are, and as a right, ought to be free and independent states, a proposition which was endorsed as accepted on June 7, 1776. Those not familiar with this bifurcated process, which even appears in the Broadway musical and film production on the topic, find an authorization for that legislative body to proceed on a precipitous course by resolution and an enabling enactment by declaration, a procedure still followed today by legislative bodies, whether adopting first a policy and proceeding forth with a policy implementation plan, or by proposing a budget and proceeding to pass authorizations for spending. But these source documents, most notably the Declaration, for most every American by popular legacy represent our self-evident rights, more often less from an examination based upon empirical inquiry as much as by faith, and a faith which one South Carolina conservative, Strom Thurmond, an attorney by profession who never attended a formal law school, just like Abraham Lincoln, feared even in the tempestuous year of 1968 that we as a nation had a faith that we had not kept. Most are familiar from childhood with the story of Hansel and Gretel, who ventured one day into the woods, but who took the deliberate steps not to get lost, not necessarily by taking a compass and a map and knowing their pace count as we do in navigation in the Army, but by laying down breadcrumbs to enable them to return safely to their home. And most are familiar with their fate after their great and fantastical plan failed to survive first contact with the enemy, the crow. Ironically, a creature found in great abundance in Arlington, Virginia, which even the Washington Post concedes is the center of gravity for Virginia's 8th Congressional District, the Kingmaker Congressional District that decides the outcome in all statewide and national elections, as it did indeed in 2016, when Hillary Clinton defeated the president by a margin of only 5 points, and where in every campaign email to date, it seems Senator Mark Warner now reminds us that he won his seat by a slim margin of only 1. And the founders, during the adoption of the Declaration, too, expressed concern that an inchoate nation might fail in its deliberate steps to embark on a noble experiment in democracy, celebrating their independence and rights as men, and provided that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. A survey course in an introductory curriculum in a liberal arts college on the subject of political science or government, might describe this statement as a statement of legitimacy, a characteristic that any government must possess to avert that condition which Jefferson describes in the very next phrase, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these needs, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. In the American tradition, the idea of deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed finds its expression operationally in regular and democratic elections, a topic of great interest these days since the last presidential election for some who apparently woke up surprised and questioned the legitimacy, to use the proper term, of that process even today. Exercise of an asserted right of those people to alter or abolish and institute new government, bringing forth articles in impeachment on declaration that the present government has become destructive of its ends and have proceeded on a course designed to affect their safety and happiness. A term in right which Jefferson described as self-evident and unalienable, but which connotes not an emotional sentiment, this happiness, light and transient in cause, but rather that state of existence in full enjoyment of our natural and endowed rights. But it is often said that a faith unexamined is not worth holding. Yet when a man, as defined by biology, attempts to enter a ladies' room, or when a Congress chooses to assert its prerogative, the first line of argument always proceeds from a declaration that that determination arises from some inherent and unalienable right. And, as we know, any schoolyard bully is familiar with the laws of the jungle that are presumed by political philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, the author of the Leviathan, ironically, which means the giant, in a state of nature, solitary, nasty, brutish, and sure, with precedence granted in right of assertion and natural selection by brute force and might. But in an age of enlightenment and reasoning, some, like John Locke, and many of the founders, are at least presumed to have proceeded from an assumption of man's nature as a noble savage that was elevated from this primordial state, distinguishing himself as unique and superior to the nature of the beast. But what, in an ideology arising from human secularism, placing faith in science and nature and reason, gives rise to this elevated status above all others in creation, as it cannot be presumed that merely thinking makes it so. And even as early as the 2nd century in Great Britain, this distinguishing characteristic arose from a concept, theological in nature, that man possessed a soul, breathed into his existence at what was called the quickening, around the 16th week of gestation in the womb, a thought which even a progressive publication like the Atlantic and Seeds found very consistent prosecutions for abortion as early as the 13th century, even if they argue that these, like even today in a courtroom, matters find resolution on, as we say in the law, other preliminary grounds, which they dismiss as moralistic pretensions, a familiar argument still found today on many social issues with which some disagree, for whatever reason. There is no doubt in review of the history of the founding of the nation, which found the father of our country, even instituting the office of chaplaincy for the Continental Army, while they encamped during a rough winter at Valley Forge, or in reading the words of James Madison in the Federalist regarding the balance of powers being checked by competing interests of religious sects, or even in John Adams' address to the Massachusetts militia as he observed that our Constitution, distinguished from any other, our Constitution was created for a religious and moral people, not suited to any other, a statement of faith in the institutions of faith as a necessary condition for democracy in America, that a nation so conceived and so dedicated might long endure. And in an age of declining faith, where, according to the Pew Research Center, 58% of Americans report that religion is far less important than it was just 2 decades ago, it becomes an urgent and existential necessity for that nation to define what basic assumption, forming even the basis of our self-evident and inalienable rights, has amended and replaced that which the founders had acknowledged as our first liberty in the Bill of Rights, in faith guiding and shaping our conscience, which at least by anecdote appears to be found in an assumed fourth estate today that we know as the press, the source, wellspring, and source of all of our popular knowledge. All news, all the time, 24/7, 365. You give us 22 minutes, and we'll give you the world, an institution whose preordinance stands on dubious grounds even in the First Amendment, which, after the first liberty in freedom of religion, reserves to not a press, but a we the people, a right in free speech, and presents the press as only a subordinate sidekick in alternative. Even in the play and movie that has become for some the story of the Declaration of Independence, sadly, Thomas Jefferson exerts great efforts in deliberate choice of his words, and even Congressman Don Byer, the modern successor to Josiah Parker, and Thomas Claiborne, the first representatives for this district from, ironically, the anti-administration party, has asserted from his appointed experience as a United States ambassador that a choice of words can be the cause of wars, a determination he made somehow from experience serving in Switzerland, which was tested last in war in 1847, and where Graham Greene credits the invention of the cuckoo clock. And in the Declaration of Independence, which those trained in the law accept as authority as a source of law, not through incorporation by specific reference in our present Constitution, but by what is termed as integration, enabling us better to define those terms expressed within the four corners of that cherished document. Thomas Jefferson makes specific reference not just to the laws of nature which entitle men, but also those laws of nature's God, the assumed creator who endows us with our rights as Americans. And this pedantic exercise in syntax and structure bears great consequence if man is assumed to be distinct from the beasts, defining rights by assertion in brute force, because only a providence removed logically could provide a perpetual endowment of those inalienable rights, whereas an estate in rights assigned and endowed by men of or their government institutions are always subject to the whim and pleasure of the author to disinheritance in generational succession, finding great consequence in liberation theology, only permitting reinheritance when those in natural selection with force so decide to act in a beneficent grace, which history has indeed proven unerringly to be a false hope and aspiration in which to place one's unquestioning faith, and a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare those causes which impel them to the separation. Proceeding now, after what has been 4 vexing and contentious years, towards impeachment articles, like in 2010, when House Speaker John Boehner addressed the Congress. These words, for those entrusted by profession of oath to protect and preserve the Constitution, need be reminded today in a faith we have not kept. Around this chamber, looking upon us, are the lawgivers from Moses to Gaius, to Blackstone to Thomas Jefferson. By our actions today, we disgrace their values. We break the ties of history in this chamber. We break our trust with America. Let's make America great again. My name is Major Mike Webb, and I am running for U.S. Congress. With liberty, honor, and excellence, by God, we shall make America great again. Honest. This advertisement